And porn reinvests in this idea of the woman as hyper submissive, and the man as this like dominant, brute aggressor. And it's just so rapey. Hey y'all, first we have to talk about the sponsor for this video and why we're even going to have a conversation about all your questions around sex. And I did receive several questions about self-pleasuring, especially for Black women and femmes. And this, oh man, if you know, you know, and if you don't, I'm about to put you on. It's the Womanizer, the original Womanizer, premium number 2. This is the recent Womanizer from Love Honey. This is the original one. It's been updated with new technology, and this, we all know, set the world on fire for a new kind of self-pleasure. This is a high-end luxury sex toy, and what I really love about it is that it comes with 2 different heads, because it realized everyone doesn't have the same vagina or clitoris. It's eco-friendly, waterproof, and part of the new technology means you can both decide if you want to fully control this experience. It is pleasure in your hand. Do what you want with the 14 different levels of pressure, but also you can put it on autopilot mode with just one press, and it's all about discovery and orgasms and falling in love with your own body, because the pleasure is within you. And I'm absolutely in love with the luxury, the original high-end Womanizer toy. Please use my link down below if you are interested in getting one for yourself. It is an actual joy. It's divine. I'm a fan. Totally. And thank you to Love Honey for sponsoring this video. Now let's get in to the questions. I know you're ready. There were several different themes that came across in the questions that y'all submitted, so we will have them timestamped in the description box down below, and I have them in order, trying to group them together in themes so we can, this conversation kind of flows. So the first set of questions that I received was around sex education and just the way societally we tend to talk about sex. So why is sex education in America crap? Hypersexual America with no sexual education. One thing you have to think about, like, everything in this country does have historical context. And with the United States being founded on this form of slavery and then forced reproduction, one thing that had to be done was making sex a very taboo subject. We have foundationally relied on the forced reproduction via Black women to build up this nation, essentially, in part, right? And so one thing that had to happen was, and I talked about this in my video about toxic mothers, just about the history of how, like, things like rape were decriminalized, right? You had to create this idea that Black women essentially could never be criminally raped, because their bodies were always commodity. And then, you know, society doesn't like just say, oh, slavery ended, yes, human rights, here you go. Like, we get Jim Crow. And then Jim Crow ends and we get abortion movement. Yeah, we should talk about that one day. Yeah, that pro-life movement, anti-Blackness, deeply embedded. It's called ownership of the body. There was actually, oh my gosh, there's an NPR podcast that I remember listening to that was talking about, like, how Black people are seen as hypersexual, but the statistics actually show, like, we are sexually conservative, especially, like, if you look at college campuses, like HBCUs, which then do tend to have a lot of very, what I would say, draconian rules around co-ed dorms or single gender dorms and curfews and stuff like that. But I do think it's interesting that there's this idea that we are hypersexual. I don't know that people are actually engaging in that much more sex, because we also have a lot more things to distract us. Like, have you ever done your family tree? And just realize, like, folks wasn't out there doing nothing but fucking? Because the family tree will tell you that. Like, back in the late 1800s, 19 through 1920s, like, what was there to do? but be laid up. Uh-huh. We have a whole bunch of other things to do now. Now, there might be more public discussion about sex. There might be more public ownership of how people are sexual and how they explore their sexuality. And it's not so taboo to be expressive sexually. But I don't know that we are actually having any more sex historically than previous generations. The next set of questions I got was about soul ties and purity politics. So soul ties are this idea that come out of the church that every person that you engage with sexually, like you carry a piece of their soul with them. So soul ties are connected to the people we sleep with. Is this idea nonsensical? And asking how I feel about purity politics. My issue with soul ties is that oftentimes it puts the pressure on the woman, on the submissive role, on the female body. It doesn't put that same pressure on the male body, because the idea is that you have a soul tie because something is entering into you. And it often comes, I feel like, and I'm saying this anecdotally, right? So, if there are people, if you believe in soul ties and that's how you engage sexually with your partners, I'm not telling you that you are a bad person or you are absolutely wrong for holding that belief. But I also find that men often treat this theory of soul ties as if they can just wash it off. And then what happens when we have this hyperfixation on purity and therefore how many bodies you're engaging with? People don't actually learn about their own bodies. And I think part of having better sex and even just better sex education isn't so much about this idea about how you sexually engage with other people, but also understanding that your own body is a center of pleasure for yourself. The basis of having a good sexual experience in general is being able to find pleasure with your own body. That also means loving the body you inhabit, being able to give grace and compassion to this body. And what happens is when we're hyperfixated on purity and virginity and only having this sexual interaction with one person, that's fine. That can be your belief. But what happens when you actually get to that marriage and then you're in the bedroom and we've had no discussion about pleasure? We've had no discussion about sexuality. We've had no discussion about how you are allowed to desire and have certain experiences with your body, and that's okay. And instead, because we've hyperfixated on this idea of only being pure for one person, and that purity being this ethereal, all white experience, pure, clean. I mean, come on, guys. If you've ever really done it, we know this shit ain't really, it's not clean, all right? And then you're grossed out by yourself. You're scared. You're insecure. You don't want to be seen because you've never actually experienced the pleasure of your own body. So how can you then engage in giving pleasure to another person? And I think overall, better communication just has to be had around, and it's not just around sex, right? I think a lot of us don't even know how to communicate intimacy. We don't know how to communicate our desires. We don't know how to communicate about pleasure because we don't know. Again, the root of this, do you see why this was such a good sponsorship? Because self-pleasure. Hey, the accessories help you get there. But no, there is no such thing as having too many partners because again, the shame lands consistently on the women. It's somehow cisgendered, heterosexual men rarely ever get shamed for their amount of partners. But we see also this conversation about hypersexuality and being a hoe and sleeping around too much repopulate amongst queer men or masculine presenting people. Because suddenly the idea that they are having non-heterosexual engagements means that they then have to be shamed for their sexuality. And our reliance on that shame almost always comes down to oh, you a hoe, oh, you sleeping with too many people, because we don't know. We're unlearned, all right? When you in somebody else's genitalia, you're unlearned. You're all right. It's none of your business. Yeah, and this goes right into the next question of the importance of unlearning sex shame, even if one is still a virgin. Absolutely. There is so much shame around our sexual interactions. And I think that shapes a lot of the lacking that we experience in this arena. You gotta do what you wanna do for you. Because on the other side, when we get into this idea that there is a societal standard for sex, beyond the societal standard of being safe and respectful, any standard beyond that then also can be twisted. Like, you might have, held on to your virginity. And I can speak from my own experience growing up in a conservative religious household, holding on to my virginity, and then realizing that I wasn't really interested in holding on to it because the value system, and I wasn't you know what I mean? It was so weird getting to college, and there was like the Virgin Club. There was like a group of Black girls that were all like very loud and proud about their virginity, and they like made it a social currency. And then like they were mean to me, and I'm like, girl, I'm a virgin too though. Like, I ain't even kissed nobody yet. Like, but you think because I don't perform my virginity in a certain way that I can't be down? And then I ended up having all this shame about entering into my 20s and still being a virgin. And I think even with those who are firmly aligned with either celibacy or maintaining their virginity and just being very selective about who they engage with, or more so this belief that you're going to wait until marriage, there's no extramarital affairs essentially happening. There's still this idea that like, if the marriage doesn't come quick enough, something's wrong with you. If you somehow, because of your own beliefs, end up at a certain age where you have this shame about never having these experiences because that purity did not lead you to the pathway that you thought it would immediately lead you to, there's still shame. This idea of losing your virginity at 24 and how that impacts your relationships and sex advice for late bloomers. I technically was a late bloomer myself, and I don't regret anything I've ever done or did, or like necessarily how I did it. I hate this term, lose your virginity, because I didn't lose it. I know exactly where I placed it, okay? I know exactly who I opened the cookie jar for. Did he deserve it? Probably not. Was it a great experience? Absolutely not. But, I know I did it with full consent and consciousness, okay? As an adult. I think, again, this just goes back to removing the shame. Invest in your own pleasure. There's this great book that we read in the book club, Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. I actually did an author chat with her on the SVG Book Club YouTube channel. You can go check that out. But she also talks about finding pleasure within yourself. I'm also thinking of like Esther Perel has this podcast, Where Do We Begin? And one of the episodes, Indian couple who married each other because of their traditions. This husband was going out of his way to try to figure out how to please his wife sexually. And she just was not interested. And Esther was like, have you ever considered how you pleasure yourself? And when I talk about pleasure yourself, it's not just about like this idea of masturbation, right? Some of us have like soothing habits that we do. And Esther Perel in this episode was saying that the woman was constantly like petting her hair. And she's like, actually that is a masturbatory act. You are self-soothing yourself. You're anxious, you're slightly uncomfortable in this conversation right now. And a way to soothe yourself is to stroke your hair. The way some of us might tap our feet or pat our legs, or the different ways we self-soothe, you are capable of pleasuring yourself. And that pleasure doesn't always just come from your genitalia. There are other ways. It doesn't just come from like this hypersexual interaction with your body. There is pleasure derived from understanding the beauty in your body. There is pleasure derived from touch, from warmth, from elaboration, from the way you dress yourself, the way you get yourself together. Do you believe that most women's sexual experience is viewed through a male lens? I actually think that we do, more so than a male lens. We do have a heteronormative, monogamous view of our sexuality. Like, it is almost impossible, regardless of what lifestyle you claim to live, to get out of the heterosexual monogamous playing field because our society is just set up for it, right? And people will question it. And there's a lot of our shame is how we deviate from that, because why does this one setup of partnering, of sexually engaging, have to work for an entire population of people? But what I'm trying to say here is that we, even as women, kind of reinvest in, a patriarchal, hetero, monogamous lens. This idea of like this hyperfixation on submission, this hyperfixation, even if we want to be the dominant one, that there has to be a dominant and a submissive person. And again, even when we go to queer interactions or queer relationships, we're constantly asking who's the top and who's the bottom, who's the dominant and who's the submissive. When we look at, different types of relationships and sexualities, we still are asking, well, are you the dominant or are you the submissive? And that dominant is always seen as masculine and that submissive is always seen as feminine. And we reinvest in these same very binary molds. And then when we get into the bedroom and we're unsatisfied and we're unpleased and we don't know how to communicate these things, this is the setup. I don't even think it's just women. I don't think it's like this singular gender binary that we can look at and say, oh, it's just a male lens. I do think that regardless of our own identity, most of us reinvest in a hetero-monogamous understanding of sex. I was raised by Black women who taught me sex should be transactional. Now I feel used if I have casual sex and he doesn't do anything for me. And again, another question on casual sex, but I thought this framing was very interesting. So much of the conversation on social media is hyperfixated on what can he do for you. Regardless of who you are, it's he. If you are any person who dates men, there is a belief that that man has to be doing something, and it's almost always something financial. He needs to be improving your life financially. And I think transactional relationships are a bad way to look at relationships. And I'm not saying that you can't desire a partner that does things for you, right? But when you make it transactional, you are at some point going to lose significance, because then you're placing this idea that your sex always has to bring a transactional value. And how does that shape how you see yourself? I'm not suggesting that anyone has to engage in casual sex, because it comes down to what you and your needs are. But when you place a value on your sex, and when that value isn't met, how does that then inform you of your own preview of yourself? How does that inform your own confidence? That would be my bigger concern than this idea of you not enjoying casual sex because you don't derive anything from it, because I actually think that's not an uncommon feeling, that casual sex is unfulfilling. I was a late bloomer, yes. I did not fall in love. I mean, actually, I was very fortunate. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Not falling in love with a man until I was in my 30s, girl. Wouldn't change it. Might even just take that one back, okay? But I realized, like, one of the biggest things of dealing with a breakup like that, it was my first, like, breakup with somebody I was in love with, was, like, the big difference between having sex with somebody that I was in love with versus having casual sex. But there is a thing that I realized when I interrogated that I liked feeling safe. I liked being with somebody who made me feel safe. I liked being with someone who I cared about. That enhanced the sexual experience, because the intimacy that was shaped around safety and compassion and caring was much more valuable to me than a casual experience where someone was just physically good at the act. But that's just me. That doesn't have to be you. You might enjoy and find that safety comes from not having an emotional attachment, that you rather enjoy the more physical aspects of it, or you enjoy the mystery of it, or maybe you even enjoy the deviance of it. That really comes down to you. Casual sex, is it healthy? Or is it wrong to not be interested in it? And how hookup culture has turned into situationships. It's just different language for the same daggone thing. It's all casual. There's no strings attached. Different things work for different people. And you go through different seasons in your life. Who's to say that I'm going to have the same views about how I approach sex now that I will in the next decade of my life? maybe you get to a point where you do just want the physical interaction. Also, when we talk about like the theories around partnering and relationship, one thing I want to also say is that like I can have whatever theoretical viewpoint I have on this topic, right? And it could be as well informed as I want it to be. But we also have to acknowledge what our material realities are. And a part of how we approach intimacy and sex will also be shaped by our access to romance and how we desire that to show up in our lives. And sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you only have the bandwidth for certain things. And that is okay. As long as you are in an examined state and you are taking care of yourself and you are being, there is no hard line about is casual sex healthy or not. Sex is unhealthy when it's non-consensual. Sex is unhealthy when you're being coerced. Sex is unhealthy when you're being lied to. You can be lied to in a casual relationship. You can be lied to in a monogamous partnered relationship. You can be lied to in a poly, pan, whatever identity, whatever nomenclature, whatever grouping you're falling into. Sex can be made not simply that this one type of sex is inherently unsafe or bad. Our situationships can become bad when we are not being honest about what we desire. And then we are trying to project those unspoken desires onto a person who we know is never going to be more than how they are currently showing up in our lives. And rather than being in an examined state with ourselves and moving from the true desires that we have, we'll hold on to situations and we'll keep ourselves in situations because we're maintaining, but then get frustrated with that person when they're not becoming more, but they never intended to. That's when things are bad, you know? That's when it goes awry. But that also comes down to communication. That also comes down to self-awareness. That comes down to a lot of hard work. All right, now let's talk about porn. When will society address how sick porn is or free porn is? And how lacking and skewed it is when it comes to Black people and women. I think porn at large encourages rape culture. It goes back to why we have bad sex education, right? We don't have sex education. And so often, if you don't grow up in a household where your parents, most of us don't. I happen to have the privilege of having one parent who was very open about talking about sex and definitely reaffirmed that it's not even so much simply about this idea of love, but this idea of compassion and respect and safety should definitely be at the forefront of who you engage with. But that instead, most of us are never having that conversation, and we've turned to porn, and porn reinvests in this idea of the woman as hyper submissive, and the man as this like dominant, brute aggressor, and it's just so rapey. And then, you know, I mean, I grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, so maybe it's changed. I haven't bothered to look recently, but you know, in the early 2000s it was like, oh, well, go watch lesbian porn, but at that time it was all white women. And I do think it matters that not only do you see yourself represented racially in these interactions or gender-wise, gender, sexuality, or race-wise, but also that you see your body type reflect. Idea that everyone, oh man, this reinvestment in like BBL culture, so big tits, big ass, very flat stomachs, uptake in the accessibility of plastic surgery has definitely taken over this identity of how our body should perform in the bedroom. It's quite wild. But I actually think porn is a horrible way to learn about sex. Okay, so the next set of questions about polysexual relationships, how they're everywhere now, open relationships, and, you know, my general thoughts on polyamory. So in a video I did last year, I talked about this book, The Ethical Slut, which is a book that I personally really enjoy. And I do think that some people took that as like, I don't think these questions are hitting on that, but I do remember some of the comments in the video were about like, oh, you're just doing poly because you broke up and with a man. And it's like, that book actually very much so turned me off from the idea of polyamory, because polyamory is a lot of work. And the problem currently with the broader discussion of polyamory is, again, this is what you have to think about with everything to do with sex. How is these conversations about sex reinvesting in a heteronormative standard? this idea of a man and two women. And that's the presentation of polyamory. This idea that polyamory simply comes down to sex and wanting to have sex with multiple people. That's actually an open relationship. The difference between polyamory and an open relationship is an open relationship says you can have, under whatever parameters you and your partner set up, that you can have sex with other people. Now, polyamory is more that multiple partners that are significant in your life. I don't want to say that there's not a hierarchy, because whatever works for you works for you. You might have your core partner and you desire to bring in another person to that relationship. And you and your partner are deciding how that other person is showing up in your relationship. But it's not simply about the idea of sex. And it's not simply about this idea that somehow men are more sexual creatures than women. I don't have any issue with a poly or open relationship. It comes down to what you and your desires are. But I do think both types of relationship take a lot of work, because they both require you to be in an examined state. And again, a lot of this conversation about sex, I'm going to bring it back to you, the individual, the person, and understanding the pleasure you derive from your own body and what are your own desires. Because when a lot of us start to interrogate and think about having sex with multiple people or engaging with multiple people, at the root of it, like, I don't really have a desire to be emotionally attached to multiple people at this point in my life. It's a lot of work. A lot of us will think it's a lot of work, but it really just comes down to what you and your needs are. And that's how you have to consider it. But I think poly is popular conversation, especially in the Black community, because we're trying to deal with all the trauma. It's a pandemic, babes. We went from Jim Crow to the crack epidemic to mass. I didn't even start with slavery, babe. You see what I did there? I started in the 1950s, okay? Jim Crow, the crack epidemic, mass incarceration, the recession, and now we're in the third year of a pandemic. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of trauma that we are all trying to work through. And therapy is not accessible. I know people love to throw therapy out as the solution to everything, but therapy, one, all therapists are not good therapists, and they can be expensive. Some of them don't even take health insurance. If you have the privilege of having access to health insurance, it can be very difficult to find a quality therapist that you really feel good about. And so therapy at this point and at this juncture is not a good enough solution to provide to people. And so people are often turning to things that are presented as these novel ideas, and not realizing that they really do take more work. Not realizing that the same problems that you are seeing within the way you were dating monogamously are going to repopulate regardless of whatever form of relationship you try to shape if you don't do the work internally first. Why is it taboo to discuss pleasuring yourself? Girl, I don't know. Because We Vibe sent me this wonderful, I'm going to try to put the packaging together because it's so pretty, but babes, we don't see no problems. Use my link down below and get with the program. Why is everyone's mid-30s libido at a high, low? Can I define it? Yeah, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really define specifically how people's libidos are supposed to work in their 30s. And also, I don't want to reinvest in ableism here, because different things happen to different folks. And this idea that, come on, I love the WAP song, but it's okay. It's okay that different people have different interactions. Some of us are dealing with trauma that appears in the bedroom. Some of us are dealing with medical issues. Some of us have disabilities. And your body is never going to consistently show up the same way throughout your entire life. There are different seasons, there's different periods, and rather than setting the standard of what your libido should be doing at this age and how you should be showing up sexually, I want to give room and space for not hyperfixating on this act of penetration, but the idea that sex and intimacy can be explored for a variety of bodies, for a variety of gender identities, for a variety of sexual identities. And it comes down to giving the space for everyone to have safe spaces to explore. And I feel like if we actually broaden the space and we didn't reinvest in bigoted language around gender, sexuality, disabledness, that we would have a better playing field of just romantic partners because now I'm being asked about having a high sex drive and the other person doesn't last long enough for you, and differing libidos between partners. Exploration, y'all. Exploration. And have you even communicated this to your partner? Have you asked what's going on with them? Sometimes we're so worried about hurting the other person's feelings. But if you enter into a conversation with compassion and integrity, it's not that you're always going to get a good response. Can't guarantee that, babe. You're not always gonna have the same libido as your partner. Stress, life, health, kids, pandemics, okay? A lot of things outside of our control can enter into the bedroom. If we are entering into the bedroom with compassion and respect at the foundation of it, then there should be ways that you can approach and have understanding in that arena that works for you and your partners. How to understand or deal with a partner's new kinks. Babes, talk about it. And if you're uncomfortable with it, find other solutions. I don't know. I do want you to be comfortable enough to tell me your kink, but there might be some kinks that I'm just not down to participate in. But I don't want, that's something that I've had to work on. But I can be real, short with people. I can be very nope, not gonna do it. Not my labor, not interested. And not really giving the person the opportunity to work with me, to communicate, to be open and understanding. Homophobia in the Black cishet female community, an expression of sexual identity and feminine traits with men as it relates to Black and people of color women. Yeah, I as I said earlier, I think we have to divest from this gender binary that simply defines people as masculine versus feminine, as woman versus man, because beyond even the idea of gender identity and non-binary and trans people, also this idea that your partner, based on their gender, can only show up a certain way is extremely harmful. And there's no way that is consistently fulfilling you and that you are deriving the most desirable, pleasurable, compassionate, respectful experience that you possibly can with who you engage in the bedroom. Because if you come in with all that judgment, and if you come in with all this judgment based on what? When we really interrogate our fears around this idea of men expressing any sort of their feminine selves, and I actually think when we deconstruct those binaries and we understand that we have the ability to have a spectrum of masculinity and femininity within ourselves, and that we just have to find our own comfort, what is this fear of queerness? What is it really rooted in? This idea that, and I think particularly the homophobia for Black cishet women shows up around biphobia, and this idea that I cannot be with a man who's bisexual because what if he cheats on me or leaves me for another man, or I don't want to be competing with another man. But the way we are set up societally and the way we enter into relationships transactionally means that we're often in competition with other women. Maybe you just don't want a person who cheats at all. And I actually think if somebody can be open and honest about their sexuality, that they likely have a much better playing field of how to communicate about their sex. And that would be the person that I would want to engage with. I think we do have a duty to create a safer playing field for people to explore their sexuality. That includes, if we want to have a safer playing field for how we can explore our sexuality, we also have to provide that for other people. And the fear of dating a bi or queer man just reinvests that people should hide themselves. And I also think we have to stop claiming that men who engage in bad behavior are gay. The idea that Kevin Samuels, because of his misogyny, because of the harmful and violent rhetoric that he pushes out around Black women, is gay? No, babes. No. That also pathologizes gay people. That suggests that gay people are inherently criminal. They're deviant and they are wrong. And that's not the way to go. And I also see queer people re-engage in this sort of messaging that, if he acts a certain way, that he has to be. One side that I also want to talk about within the homophobia cishet Black women is it's often uplifted by other gay men in their community. Because I know there's conversation that's brewing, and it has to happen, and it should be happening around the biphobia that cishet Black women have and how that is homophobic. But also, like, so often they'll just go talk to their gay homeboy and they be like, yeah, girl, I wouldn't do that neither. And there's biphobia within the gay community. And so we have to be attacking both sides if we're really going to progress. Okay, and the last question I'm going to do is, would you stay with a man that is a provider but not the best sex you've had? You know, I think that sexual interaction can be worked on. That you can get to a point of having better sex with a person, but that, you know, there's so much outside of the bedroom that impacts how you show up in the bedroom with each other. For me personally, I'm not a person who's fixated on this idea that my partner needs to be the financial provider, because there are other things that are much more significant to me than simply paying all the bills. Mostly because I don't desire to be kept in that manner, because I still want to work and do my own thing. And so, you know, not to say that, oh, I pay all the bills, you know, definitely financial stability is something that I desire, but I would rather be with someone who makes my life easier. And there's so many things that engage with that, right? There's things that are very specific to who I am as a person that I then need in a significant other, and there's no way that we are having good sex consistently without those things generally being met. Yeah, so many things outside of the bedroom will show up in the bedroom. So thanks for watching, and I'm gonna holla at y'all later. Deuces.